So today I'm going to show you how to trim a bottle form on the wheel. I have these 6 bottles. I usually work in a series of 5 or so at a time. And this process is helpful to have multiples, so it makes it worth your effort to create a chuck specifically for these forms. So this one is quite a bit smaller than this one, and the great thing about making this type of chuck that I'm going to show you, it's a wet chuck that is movable, changeable as you're working with it. It's great because you can work with the same chuck for big forms and for smaller forms and sort of alter it as you go. So I'm going to get these out of the way. And I'm gonna make my chuck based on this biggest form here, so I can kind of make it smaller as I go. It's usually easier to start with the biggest one and make sure you have enough clay and enough depth in your chuck to make this work. So I'm gonna set that here, and I'm gonna tilt this down a bit. Okay, so I am going to get my lump of clay centered for this piece. I have probably a little over 1.5 pounds of clay to start. So I'm going to get my clay centered as usual. And the biggest difference for making a chuck from a regular vessel form is that I make the chuck without a bottom. And the chuck is sort of like a cooling tower shape. So you'll see what I end up throwing here. Okay, so once I have a piece of clay centered, I'm going to break it in the center as usual. And then I'm going to go all the way down to the bat, not leaving a bottom on my chuck. My pieces are, none of them are super wide, so I don't need my chuck to be super wide, but if I did have a wider, bigger form, I would start with a wider piece of centered clay, so it could be something more like out here. Because when you don't have a bottom and you try to widen this form, sometimes it'll pull right off of the wheel, so you want to make sure that you have the width correct to start. Okay, so I'm all the way down to the bottom, and I can see the blue of my bat now. And I'm going to start to pull outward. And then I'm going to push down just a little bit to make sure that that doesn't roll off. I'm going to make it a tiny bit wider. So I'm going to pull out. And I'm kind of pushing down slightly just to make sure that's really going to stay on the bat. And now I'm going to start to pull up. If I go too wide and I have not enough clay, then this taller piece is going to hit the bottom. You'll see what happens when I put the piece in here. So I need to make sure that this part is tall enough that it's going to rest on the shoulder of the piece. And this is a little bit off center. And I will want it to be somewhat centered because it's going to affect how my piece actually sits in the form. So I'll fix that eventually. Okay, so now I'm going to bring a little bit of a waist inward, bringing this up. I'm keeping it relatively thick. It's closer to at least 3/8 of an inch thick, maybe 1/2 inch. And I need that for stability. And now I'm going to, that wobble came up to the rim, and so now I'm going to trim most of that off. Get rid of that clay. And now it's a little bit more in control, and that way I have a nice even rim for when I put my piece in here. Just getting rid of the water at the bottom because I need this to dry up a little bit. And my piece is pretty narrow, so I'm going to go in just a little bit further. Make sure that will rest in the right spot. And then I'm going to dry this up a little bit with a hair dryer. Okay, so that's a pretty good start to it. And now I'm going to get my hands kind of clean and dryish, so I'm not picking up my hair dryer with wet hands since it is electric. Some people will use a propane torch to dry their piece, which is probably a little bit safer in some ways as far as electricity and water goes. Okay, so right now this is like, I've gotten rid of most of the shiny wet areas on the piece just with the sponge. And I'm going to use the hair dryer so that it's not really shiny at all. It gets kind of dull on the surface and it's no longer sticky to the touch. So right now I leave pretty obvious fingerprints when I touch the piece. So I want to get rid of that characteristic by drying it a little bit more. Okay, so you can see it doesn't take too long. That's no longer shiny, but it's still a little bit pliable. Like I can pull that out slightly and it changes the shape. So that's just the characteristic that I'm looking for. So now let's see if I have my size right. So I'm gonna put my piece in, and right now the rim of my piece here is touching the bat. So this is not narrow enough or tall enough. So I'm gonna try to narrow it up, make it slightly taller when I do that. And I'm going to try to not add any more water. Sometimes I have to and then dry it again, but usually I just try to add or move it around without any water at all. So I'm just using my fingertips. Normally when I collar in, I get my hands wet and squeeze inward, but that's going to introduce more water than I want. So I'm kind of shortcutting this, just using basically one hand. Okay, let me see how that works. Okay, so now it's not touching the bottom of the bat and it's resting on the shoulder here on the clay piece. So that's good. That's how I want it. Now the great thing about this chuck is that normally if I make this chuck shape with, or I use a bisque-fired chuck, first I have to hold it on with wads of clay, but it's pretty stiff and well, it's totally bone dry, or sorry, bisque-fired. So it's very dry. It's completely stiff actually. And this is nice and soft still. So it's kind of sticking to the piece. It's holding it in there just by itself. It's already like centered. The key is getting this, you know, when I set it in here, I want to make sure that it's level. So first I'm going to check to see if it's level. And actually I got lucky on this one. This one is pretty darn level. And then I'm going to check to see if it's centered. So I'm resting my hands against my body. I'm on a stand-up wheel right now. So normally if I'm sitting, I would do it on the splash pan if I can. So it's pretty close to centered, but I think I can get it a little better. So this is where it's touching. So I am going to just push in like downward slightly and then inward from away from where my finger was touching. Okay, still doing it a little bit over here. So it's just a small amount of pressure. I think that's pretty good there. And now because I pushed downward, it's kind of like sealed on there a little bit better. If I didn't push downward and I go to do my trimming, I might pull it off center a lot easier, or push it off center. Okay, so now I can use a decent amount of speed. I'm going to start at the outside corner here and start to remove some of the clay. So yeah, this is, I would trim as I normally do at this point, and then once I get my piece totally trimmed and finished, again, sometimes things can move and you can always just easily put your piece back in there, push downward, and then move it side to side pretty easily. But anyway, I would completely trim this, pull it off, and then I would alter it again just like I did that last round for the next piece. It might need to be wider, it might need to be narrower, but I can do that really easily all just with the same chuck. So hopefully this makes trimming narrow necked forms or bottle forms a lot easier for you.